Hello and welcome to Byjus Exam Prep IAS. As part of a comprehensive news analysis, today we'll be discussing 5 important articles out of the Hindu newspaper daily edition. Before we start, some important announcements for you. First, that we are available on Telegram now, so do subscribe to us on Telegram. Further, we are having an important workshop on the BEP app on 1st October at 6 p.m. and Harshmeet sir will be talking about 10 must-read books for UPSC preparation and the examination itself. Further, we also have some offline workshops which are going to happen in Pune, Bangalore and Jaipur. So I would encourage you to go out there, and if you are in these cities, to meet our faculties and interact with them. Now with this, let's start our analysis. The first news which we need to discuss is a very important one, which is a landmark judgment by the Supreme Court yesterday, and in it the Supreme Court, after 51 years of a draconian law, argued that an unmarried woman who is pregnant 20 to 24 weeks can now take the assistance of a doctor to get an abortion. So the Medical Termination of Pregnancy MTP Act of 1971 actually argued that unmarried women who are between 20 to 24 weeks pregnant were not allowed to abort with a registered doctor. So the 1971 Act very straightforward said that it is illegal, it prohibited unmarried women between 20 to 24 weeks of pregnancy to abort a fetus via a registered doctor. However, now the Supreme Court via this judgment has argued that single women with pregnancies between 20 to 24 weeks are entitled to access the same safe and legal abortion care as a married woman. Therefore, the Supreme Court has now removed the distinction between married and unmarried. And this is extremely significant in the context of what is happening in all across the world, specifically in America, where Roe v. Wade was actually scrapped and the right to abort a child was taken away from a woman. The women's control over their own reproductive capacity was taken away from them in America, which was one of the most draconian and conservative laws ever passed from the Supreme Court of America. But our Supreme Court has shown the way to the world. It is holding a light to what is happening all across the world, that now legalized abortion is now also available to unmarried women in the same period in which a married woman could get it legally. Now they are also entitled to legal abortions. The gravity of this act is extremely important because women in this time period, 20 to 24 weeks of pregnancy, are very vulnerable, and in India a lot of deaths were happening because of illegal abortions. Therefore, the Supreme Court has straight away struck down the draconian law, saying that there is no difference between a married or an unmarried woman when it comes to her own reproductive capacity. Therefore, a very landmark and significant judgment. So let's try to understand this for GS paper 2. How can it be asked in the examination? What is the basic concept which the Supreme Court has used to actually overturn the law and remove this major impediment to single women in that regard? So the rights of reproductive autonomy, dignity and privacy give an unmarried woman the right of choice as to whether or not to bear a child on a similar footing as a married woman. This is a very new type of argument which has come through against everything else which is happening all across the world. The court declared that prohibiting single women with pregnancies up to 24 weeks from assessing abortion while allowing married women with the same terms of pregnancy to avail it was a form of discrimination. The court said that a single woman may have suffered the same change in material circumstances as a married pregnant woman. Then how is that, when the material circumstances being the same, why is that we're discriminating against a single woman? This is patriarchy at its worst, and this is patriarchy how it works. Therefore, the law should not decide the beneficiaries of a statute based on narrow patriarchal principles about what constitutes permissible sex. And this is extremely significant because it is arguing that we, as the legal system, jurisprudence itself, the Indian jurisprudence cannot decide what is permissible sex and what is not permissible sex. Therefore, we cannot decide if the pregnancy of a single woman or a married woman is legal and illegal in that regard. This would create a lot of invidious classifications, which is very problematic and draconian in that regard. I cannot say how significant this act is because it has now created a new pool of understanding under which the concept of reproductive capacity is now with the woman rather than the interpreter of the law. And the basic judgment came out after very troubling statistics which we see with regards to illegal abortions. 8 women die every day in India due to unsafe abortions. 67% of all the abortions carried out between 2007 to 2011 were classified unsafe. Illegal abortion is a continuing crisis when it comes to unmarried women. Specifically, 20 to 24 weeks is a very dangerous period to abort in an illegal circumstance. The court said that the artificial distinction between married and unmarried women was not constitutionally sustainable, an extremely revolutionary line in that regard. The state therefore would be stripping single women of their autonomy over their own bodies and lives by forcing them to carry unwanted pregnancies to full term. And the reproductory autonomy included the right to choose whether or not to have an abortion. A woman does not need the permission or the basic consent of a third party to abort. And this is a very significant standpoint. Let's try to understand this in a much more deeper understanding. See, the judgment is extremely revolutionary. It's extremely landmark and extremely important because at the end of the day, now the distinction, which is an artificial distinction between married and unmarried women, which is technically created via patriarchal understanding of our society, where the concept of reproduction within a married circumstance and an unmarried circumstance is seen as two different forms of acts. Therefore, the fact that this artificial distinction has been removed by the Supreme Court opens up a new understanding and a very progressive understanding of legal jurisprudence towards women. Women finally have the right to decide for themselves if they can abort or not. It's not about the man deciding for the woman within the married context, and an unmarried woman does not have the right to do that. This is why this judgment is seen as landmark, because this is for the first time that they have given the women the right to choose what they do to their body. And whilst we have all this data which tells us that illegal abortions are very dangerous when it comes to how women go into certain illegal institutions to get abortions when they are single between 20 to 24 weeks, what is more significant is that there has been a trend in America and specifically in the West where abortions are now becoming this concept of pro-life, that the fetus is also a life, so you can't abort it. This whole Christian understanding of pro-life and pro-abortion concept, and the draconian concept of scrapping Roe v. Wade, which was recently in the news. Therefore, India is actually becoming a light bearer for women's empowerment, and this is a very significant step in that regard. So this judgment, we will see how it then unfolds and how the government creates a certain legal framework so as to make sure that the act itself is repealed and a new act is brought in. But as of right now, we should be extremely proud of this judgment, because in the context of what is happening across the world, finally women, irrespective of their marital status, have control over their own reproductive capacity. A very significant concept and a very significant development in that regard, and I hope that you can understand the gravity in that sense. With this, let's move to the second topic, which is the draft Telecommunications Bill 2022. This is on the other spectrum of the story, where the government is trying to now bring in parity between telecom service providers and the OTT platforms which are there. However, there are also problematic aspects to this law because it is giving too much power to the government itself. So under GS paper 2 it becomes part of governance, and under GS paper 3 you can use it for telecom regulations. Now, what is the basic concept here? The basic concept is very simple. You have telecom service providers such as Airtel, Jio, Vodafone, henceforth, and you have OTT messenger platforms such as WhatsApp, Telegram, or any other platform which is used by us as of today. What the telecom service providers say, TSPs say, is that we create the physical infrastructure, we take licenses, we are the ones who are buying spectrum, we are doing everything, and we provide the internet, which the OTT platforms, not in the context of Netflix, it's not about entertainment, it's about telecommunication. So what they're arguing is that we are putting in the brick and mortar all the investment, but the OTT platforms are using WhatsApp, iMessage, even Telegram, are using the same internet to then compete with us and cut our basic revenue in the form of not having calls and SMSs on our own network. So Airtel and Jio are losing money because people are less using the calls and the SMS feature, and rather they're using WhatsApp call or WhatsApp messages to actually send messages in that regard. So what the TSPs have been arguing for a very, very long time, that you need to bring them at parity with us. The fact that they are using our infrastructure to gain a profit and we are losing revenue. Therefore, this bill becomes important in that regard because it is trying to induce that parity. Therefore, this new bill is trying to bring in a new dimension to this sector itself. So the Ministry of Communication released a draft Indian Telecommunications Bill 2022 last week. The draft is an attempt by the government to update the extant regulatory framework, keeping in view with the advancement and challenges in this sector. And the problem is that the three acts which are already there are quite old and don't understand the new world in which we live in. So this is much needed because the legislation which is available is very, very outdated, and the most recent of them was actually introduced 70 years back. So let's look at these acts in that sense. The acts are actually Indian Telegraph Act, which was enacted in 1885, Indian Wireless Telegraphy Act enacted in 1933, and Telegraph Wires Unlawful Possession Act of 1950. So basically, after we becoming a republic, there has been no real significant development or law in this section. Therefore, it becomes important that the Telecommunication Act comes at the level in which we live in. Therefore, over the top communication OTT services refer to the services that provide real-time person-to-person telecommunication services. Examples are WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal, Messenger, Duo, Google Meet, etc. These platforms use the network framework of telecom service providers, TSPs, Airtel, Vodafone, Jio, to compete with the telecom communication services such as voice calls and SMS. So basically, they use their platform to gain their own profit, and the TSPs have been alleging that these features result in a double whammy for them, as they have to cut their own sources of revenue whilst have to deal with the infrastructure and licensing cost that they have to undertake generally. Therefore, the TSPs have been demanding a level playing field with the OTT telecom platforms, and this is actually justified in a way because everything from spectrum buying to creating the infrastructure to giving us internet, the TSPs are the ones who are putting in the investment, but they just use that same investment which is put in with the TSPs to generate their own profit. So they have no brick and mortar on the ground capital investment, but they are generating revenue in that regard. So what are the major changes which this act is trying to bring in? First, that it is trying to define telecommunication services to add OTT communication services to it. More than that, OTT telecommunication services may be then subject to the same licensing conditions as the TSPs. Then there would be concept of know your customer. They would have to buy licenses. That would also mean that they would come under the regulatory framework of the government itself. So if OTT communication services are required to obtain the same license, they would also be subject to the same conditions, maintaining know your customer details of their users, adhering to certain encryptional or encrypting regulations, allowing lawful access to the government when it comes to their equipment and network. And this has been a long standing debate, that can the government ask for someone's encrypted WhatsApp messages? This is very, very significant because herein comes the concept of privacy. Because if they go under the same framework as Airtel or Vodafone, where the police services or any form of governmental services can ask for basic data of the user, now WhatsApp messages could be asked by the government for basic surveillance and need for criminal investigation. So this is the problematic aspect. That is why a lot of stakeholders are saying that if you put OTT into the same framework, then you are actually pushing our privacy in the digital zone into that zone also. Therefore, to curtail the even increasing incidence of spam calls and frauds, the draft bill also proposes that the identity of the person communicating using any form of telecommunication services shall be available to the user receiving that communication. So we get these spam messages which just say TX this and they have a numerical thing. Rather, now we will know who is sending this message rather than having EXE1256, something like just random number and a combination of letters are there. We will have the proper identity of the person who's sending us this message. We could block him, and if the telecom provider or the OTT platform is not ready to give us that, 50,000 rupees fine is also there for every user. Now, as I said, two aspects here. First aspect is, yes, it's a good thing that they come under the same regulatory framework, and Airtel, Jio and all these OTT platforms are on the same level. However, if you then do that, then you push our privacy also into that zone, and the concept of encrypted messages, what we are talking about, what is the way the government is monitoring, and then comes the concept of mass surveillance. This is the problematic aspect. On the other hand, it also has its advantages, because then this spam calls and fraud which are happening now, just using random numbers or something in which they're using WhatsApp or any form of Telegram signal in which there is anonymity, that would be gone. It's a double-edged sword in that regard. So we don't know how this will go forward in that way. Though the general tone of the article is a little bit cautionary, it is a little bit dangerous that the TRAI, which is Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, the sections related to TRAI have now been diluted, and a lot of regulatory framework has been taken away from TRAI, and it is now being made into a recommendatory body. So the government would no longer have to require or technically seek the recommendations of the TRAI before issuing licenses to anybody. Further, it also removes the power of TRAI to requisite from the government information or documents related to such recommendations. So when it came to giving anybody a random license for being a telecom provider, now the government can take it standalone without the recommendations of TRAI, and TRAI cannot ask for any documents if they're giving this basic license to someone else. So this again is a problematic aspect, because then the government itself becomes the Ministry of Telecom. The Ministry of Telecommunication itself becomes the regulatory and the enacting body. It becomes the executive and the legal body itself, which is the problem. TRAI needs to be independent. Who is getting licenses is very, very important, and that needs to be checked from time to time. And this is again an aspect of the act which is a little bit alarming. Further, for the first time in the Indian legal framework, there's a specific provision which says that the government could order suspension of internet, and basically they would not need any form of sanction or recommendation from any other body. As of right now, the suspension of internet is ordered under the Temporary Suspension of Telecom Services Public Emergency and Public Safety Rules of 2017, and that was made under the Indian Telegraph Act of 1885. However, with this, what is going to happen is that now the government will become the suo motu body. It will become the only body to take in cognizance that yes, we have to now remove internet access in a certain area, and there would be no oversight over it. TRAI already has no oversight in that regard. So in a way, this bill is a little bit problematic, because as much as it has this parity concept, it is also based on the concept of giving government too much power, and the bill also tries to clear the issues related to spectrum allocation. It lays down, while the primary route of allocation of spectrum is auction, however, for government purposes such as defense or transportation and administrative purposes, governmental procedure will be followed. So the government can say that for certain functions such as defense and transportation and administrative purposes, administrative process will be followed rather than the auction concept. And it also allows the telecom service providers, the TSPs, to exploit its spectrum resources fully by enabling sharing, trading, leasing, surrendering or returning unutilized spectrum. And it also makes it easier for restructuring, merging and demerging these spectrums in that regard. So what have we done till this point? We first understood the landmark judgment of the Supreme Court, which was based on the concept of abortions for 20 to 24 weeks unmarried women. Now they have the same right as a married woman when it comes to 20 to 24 weeks, and the draconian law used for the last 51 years is now gone. And the basic point is, it is extremely significant in the context of what is happening all across the world. Now women have control over their reproductive potential also. The draft telecommunication bills, now this is a draft bill, so we don't know how it is going to transform later. However, as of right now, it has 2-3 positives but a lot of negatives. The positive is that yes, OTT platforms should be answerable and should have a level playing field with the TSPs. The TSPs have been asking for that, and the TSPs are entitled to do that. It's a competitive market. It should be like that. However, when it comes to diluting the TRAI regulations, the fact that the government is a single authority which can now ask for internet suspension, and more than that, the fact that they can now also single-handedly give licenses without the trial looking towards them or asking any questions is a problematic aspect of the law. So let us see how the government takes in the different comments from different stakeholders, and we believe that the government would try to make sure that yes, there would be parity and there would be an attempt therefore to make the trial not redundant and would have some form of recommendatory authority and autonomy in these sectors. And telecommunications today is a very, very important sector of the economy itself. It is the backbone of our economy as of right now, and we need to make sure that there is no such law which makes the government the judge, jury and the executioner. With this, let's move to the third topic, which is related to pediatric cardio care services. It's an interesting article because yesterday was World Heart Day, so it was released as a form of a major cautionary tale and a problematic aspect of heart disease in India, which is infant heart diseases. That is why pediatric cardio care services. What the author therefore argues is that congenital heart disease, which is by birth heart diseases as identified by the CDC in the US, is one of the most common congenital disorders and is responsible for 28% of all congenital birth defects and accounts for 6 to 10% of all infant deaths in India. And this is the aspect on which the author tries to emphasize on the World Heart Day, which is that infant health and congenital heart disorders are very common in India. However, we do not have the infrastructure, the regulatory framework, not even the basic understanding on how to tackle this problem. So she first tells us the quantum of the problem. Pediatricians have argued that timely medical intervention can save 75% of these children, giving them normal lives. The lack of a national policy for the treatment of cardiovascular diseases in children keeps a huge number outside the ambit of treatment. It is estimated that over 1 lakh children keep getting added to the existing pool of awaited surgeries, and basically mostly heart diseases need bypass surgery or some form of preventive surgery, and as of right now the waiting list is till 2026, which is absurd and insane in that regard, that a child born today would have to wait for 3.5 years to get a basic surgery which is important for his existence and his life. So according to the Pediatric Cardiac Society of India, the prevalence of congenital cardiac anomalies is 1 in every 100 live births. So 1 in every 100 would have some form of cardiac issue, or an estimated 2 lakh children are born with CHD every year. Only 15,000 of them receive treatment. At least 30% of the infants who have complex defects require surgical interventions to survive their first birthday itself. But only 2,500 operations can be performed each year because of the scarce resources and infrastructure in that regard. So imagine 15,000 children need surgeries, but we are only giving 2,500 of them surgeries every year. So that is creating a backlog of at least 7 times in the same year itself. This is alarming. This is a problem. Because if we are so lax when it comes to our approach towards children, they are the future of this country. And it is not that it is a rare disease, it is something which is by birth and is very common in India in that regard. So the ground reality why this is happening is because there are only 22 hospitals and less than 50 centers in India with infant or neonatal cardiac services. Neo means after birth, antenatal means before birth. So geographically these centers are not well distributed. A 2018 study tells us, a report tells us that in South India, where 70% of all these centers are, the CHD burden is quite low. On the other hand, for example, UP Bihar, where CHD is very, very high load burden, there are no real centers in that regard. So for 600 districts with a 1.4 billion population, there are only 250 pediatric cardiologists available. So doctors are not even available. And the doctor to the patient ratio is an abysmal 1 for 500 million population, which is actually problematic. Therefore, Jammu and Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh, Jharkhand, Punjab, Orissa, besides UP and Bihar, a very high CHD burden, but do not have any cardiologist in government sector itself. So what the author argues is that the way forward is that first, antenatal detection, before birth detection of congenital anomalies is crucial for neonatal care. For that, we need accurate heart health assessment equipment and services, which is not visible in normal ultrasonography of an unborn baby. So basically we need very specialized technology and machines to catch this in an antenatal stage, and that is also not there. And the only way to actually mediate this is what is called fetal echocardiography, which needs to be done on a pregnant woman of 18 to 24 weeks, which allows for better visualization of the heart itself. Now this is something which is very significant, though we don't care about it, but it is a major crisis. So this article we chose because it is a very, very dangerous precedence which is being created. There cannot be a 3-year waiting period for surgeries which can save your life. Children are the future of this country, and with the fact that we have such a common disease all across India and geographical distribution of the hospitals, the general hospitals are lacking in basic technology, and basically there's no governmental policy. This is a wake-up call for the governmental policy makers, and we need to do something about this. And this becomes significant for your GS paper 3 with regards to there are ethical issues also related here, and more than that there's also the issue of governmental amnesia, not looking towards child welfare when it comes to healthcare. Yes, healthcare sector is always overburdened in India, but this is a crisis in making and already a major crisis, and we need to intervene in that regard. With this, let's move to the next topic, which is EU's energy inflation. I chose this topic because it is a very interesting aspect to the Russia-Ukraine story. We tend to always talk about Russia, Ukraine, what is happening in Ukraine, and as of today, Russia is going to annex the 4 territories which we talked about 2 days back via the referendum taken. So they are going to annex that territory. But this is the other side of the story, which I want to emphasize, is that this is why Russia is doing what it is doing, because it has the EU by the neck. And when it comes to energy security, Europe is very weak. And when it comes to Russia's control over EU's energy, it has too much power. And the European Union, as of right now, is seeking urgent ways to bring down the skyrocketing energy prices as winter looms. And what is more significant is that yesterday we had mysterious sabotage of gas pipelines in the Nord Stream, as it is called, which provides gas from Russia to Germany, and there have been suspicious leaks in this in the recent days. As the EU was becoming more and more harsher in its rhetoric, Russia has done something to make sure that we saw these type of images where bubbles were coming up in the Baltic Sea. And the Nord 1 and the Nord 2, these are the two most important streams. These are underwater pipelines which take gas from Russia to Germany. And in the Swedish sector, we saw 3 major gas leaks. So the energy ministers in Brussels have gathered together to consider an emergency European Commission proposal that includes cutting power to the bloc and imposing windfall levies on energy companies and discussing a price cap for wholesale gas supplies. And in the context of these new leaks in the major gas supply to EU, we believe that Russia has all the cards in its hand right now. So EU sanctions on Moscow for its invasion for Ukraine, which included shunning Russian oil starting in December, have promoted the Kremlin to retaliate by severely reducing the natural gas supply. But the unexplained leaks, and this is with air quotes, the unexplained leaks on the undersea Nord Stream 1 and 2 have now exaggerated the situation also. And what we believe is that there's an energy war coming in Europe. Russia is using its biggest leverage, starving Europeans of energy, and this is the new trend which has emerged. So whilst we look towards Russia, Ukraine quite a lot, EU is feeling the heat of all these sanctions. So it is backfiring on the EU quite a lot now. So after recording a jump of 10% inflation, its government said that it will borrow 200 billion euros to shield the German households and business from an energy war. So now the Germans are preparing for an energy war, and this energy war is not a proper war, it's a proxy war wherein Russia is retaliating by starving the EU of energy and natural gas. And this was something which was never thought about in the long run, that the whole EU actually is very dependent on Russians for natural gas and oil. So European Commission is trying to leverage the COVID-19 era cooperation to forge a EU level approach, a common approach. But I have chosen this topic because I find it very interesting that we always look at the Russia side. Let's look at the EU side. EU side, there's an energy war looming, and the inflation is now taking away the savings of the people in Europe. Europe is reeling under the sanctions which they put in, and Kremlin in that sense has a lot of leverage and has all the cards in its hands right now. And this is something which will develop further later, but with the annexation of the 4 areas in Ukraine via the referendum, Russia is turning the tide. But this is the significant aspect of the story in that way. With this, let's move to the last topic, which is related to art and culture. As we know, art and culture is getting more and more linked up with the concept of current affairs. So UNESCO has created a list of 50 iconic Indian textiles. This is very significant. I will revise with you here. What we can see is that in the prelims examination, easily a question can come basically on these textiles itself. So we will look at their state and the name, and this is what we're going to learn. If you want to take a screenshot of the next slide, you can keep it with you. It will help you in the long run. So UNESCO on Thursday released a list of 50 exclusive and iconic heritage textile crafts of India. According to UNESCO, they argue that the problem is that people don't know about it. And this is the irony of India, that we ourselves don't have any interest in our own culture. But one of the major challenges to safeguarding the intangible cultural heritage in South Asia is the lack of proper inventory and documentation. We don't know what we have. We don't know how incredible India is. Therefore, this is an attempt to create that kind of a list. So the publication in turn is like bridging this gap and trying to create the 50 selected textiles, the best known for India in that regard internationally. Now this is significant because the paper is made out of the Hindu, or the UPSC will look at this paper, and I am giving you a list here. I encourage you to take a screenshot of this slide, therefore you can keep it as a list, which is extremely important. Handicraft list is very, very long, but we need to concentrate now on these ones. So what are the ones? I'll read it out to you. You have Toda embroidery and the Sungandi from Tamil Nadu, Himru from Hyderabad, Bandhatai and dye from Sambhalpur in Odisha, Khes from Panipat, Chambal Rumal from Himachal Pradesh, quite known. You have Thigma or wool tie and dye from Ladakh, very important, New UT, Awadh Jamdani from Varanasi. You have the Ilkat and the Lamdani or the Banjara embroidery from Karnataka. Then you have the Kalamkari, which comes from Thanjavur. Then you have Kumbi weaves from Goa, the Mashru weaves and the Patola from Gujarat, Himru from Maharashtra. You see, Himru, two different states, same name. And you have the Garad Khoirail from West Bengal. Now, as I said, the article is very small. This list is extremely significant for prelims. You can expect a question in prelims from any of these as form of match the following. Match the following is something which is quite common for handicraft as a question. And then you can't say that UPSC randomly asked a question. No, they didn't. There was a list which was given in the newspaper itself. So keep them with you. And how do you learn it? You just learn one each day. You can learn one each day and then repeat one every day you remember, and you will be able to remember it for the next 300 days. You will never forget any one of them. So 13 days, learn each one of them one day. Every 13 days you will then repeat it. I am not asking you anything else, just one each day. It will be enough to remember each one of them, and in the exam it could give you a strategic edge. In prelims and mains we can not expect this type of question because they can't ask you to define each one of them, but in prelims it will be a very significant question. So please remember these 13 are extremely significant for your exam because they were mentioned in the newspaper. The last point, which is that publication is actually called Handmade for 21st Century, Safeguarding Traditional Indian Textiles, and what it does is that it lists the histories and legends behind the textile, describes the complicated and secret procedures and processes which are used to make them, and the basic point is they also talk about the vulnerability, the dwindling popularity, and the ways we can preserve them and make sure that we conserve our own culture. And this topic is extremely significant for art and culture, becoming a major part of current affairs now. So before we go to the mains question, a small summary for you. First, we discussed this landmark judgment of Supreme Court, where they argued that for any woman who is unmarried and is pregnant 20 to 24 weeks, she now has legal access to registered doctors for abortion. The difference which was legally created between a married and an unmarried woman is now not there. Over and above that, they have argued that we were technically discriminating the form of abortion on the basis of the reproductory situation and material circumstances. The fact that married women had the same right and the unmarried women did not have it was a discriminatory practice, and is a very revolutionary and very progressive form of argument which was given by the Supreme Court, and we believe that this could create precedents all across the world against the tide which is there, which is embodied by America, where the reproductory capacity, the control over it was taken away from women in America. But India has done something very significant. Married or unmarried, 20 to 24 weeks, the critical period in which a woman can get an abortion, is now open legally to both of them, and the patriarchal control over the concept of reproductory capacity and abortions is now gone. Very significant in the long run. Second, we understood the draft telecommunications bill. The bill is extremely significant because it's trying to bring OTT platforms and TSPs, which is telecom service providers, to the same level, to the parity when it comes to they using the infrastructure of the TSPs to generate a profit. And more than that, there are certain negative aspects related to the bill where the government can unilaterally right now take away internet in any sector in that regard. The TRI's regulatory mechanism and its power over the Ministry of Telecommunications is gone. It is being diluted. And third, the fact of how with the introduction of know your customer and the fact that the government can ask any of the OTT platforms to give the message, the question of mass surveillance comes through. Then we discussed a very alarming and problematic aspect of healthcare in India, which is the concept of congenital cardiac problems in infants, and the fact that we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the basic regulatory framework or even policies to make sure that children don't have to wait for 3 years to get a very life-saving surgery, which is extremely important for a normal life for that child. The last two topics tried to concentrate first on the other part of the Russia-Ukraine story, which is how EU is facing the heat and is technically reeling under energy inflation, and more than that, how Russia has made sure with the Nord Stream unexplained leaks, there is now a new aspect which is coming in, which is the concept of an energy war. And the last topic which we did is UNESCO 50 textiles list, extremely significant for a prelims examination. Art and culture is becoming more and more current affairs oriented. So the 13 textiles which are mentioned in this article, I have listed them, and I believe that you will note them down and keep them with you. With this, let's look at the mains questions. First, in light of the recent judgment of the Supreme Court, discuss the issues surrounding abortions in India. So you can talk about how there was major deaths because of illegal abortions and how it is changed under this law. And there's an energy war looming in Europe. It's a very interesting question because it talks about something which can happen in the future. So you need to contextualize it with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, the Nord Stream leaks, and how EU is facing the major problem of energy security with regards to how they sanctioned Russia. It is backfiring on them. With this, I would like to end this session. Thank you so much for your patience. I will see you in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.